Okay, good morning, everyone. This time it's for real. It's not a false start. So welcome. I'm really happy to see so many people here at a little after 9 on a Friday morning. I'm Ann Stevens, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at UT. I really appreciate all of you joining us. I want to start with some slightly formal thank yous. Certainly, I want to start with our faculty panelists, both those at UT and those who have come from afar to join us today. This is really driven by your expertise and insight and your scholarly work, which is really how universities should be engaging in this type of discourse. So thank you for taking the time and giving some thought to structuring these panels. I also want to thank our amazing public affairs team in the college who have really helped handle the organization, publicity, logistics, and Leora Vysotsky in particular has been what I'm told is the master planner of this event. So if you see Leora, give her a special thanks as well. Also, special welcome. I know we have a few College of Liberal Arts alumni who have joined us today. We're always happy to have you back on campus. And finally, everyone in the audience, but especially students, I'm very happy to see some students here, and I think we'll have more as the day gets a little bit more on a student schedule as we move past early morning on a Friday. It's really critical for students to be exposed to these types of conversations, discussions, because this is part of your critical learning experience at the university, and your need to understand how this can be done respectfully and intelligently, I think it's safe to say, has never been more critical in this country. So this event has been described as exploring aspects of free speech, civil discourse, democracy, and higher education. It is all of those things, and we'll be talking and thinking about all of the interactions between those concepts. I also hope that as we explore these topics and some difficult topics, subtopics within them, I hope it can also be a bit of a celebration of what we do at the university, of what example we can set for society in engaging expertise and thought and respect, even in some of the most difficult topics that we have to wrestle with today. And that's why I'm particularly grateful to the faculty for sort of being the leaders and engaging in these conversations. So with that, there may be a slight change in schedule, but I think our first panelists have all arrived now. Dan will be the decider on that in a couple of minutes. But it's a pleasure having you here. I'm now going to turn things over to our Director of Public Affairs, Dan Oppenheimer, who will do a little bit of logistics, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Thank you.
Morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Dan Oppenheimer, Director of Public Affairs for the college. I realized I had given Ann notes on who to thank, and I left one group out, which is Lates, our technical folks who in the back corner who are recording things today and also will be live streaming some of the sessions. So thanks to our friends in Lates. They're fantastic. Just a few logistical things that I wanted to mention before we head into the program. So I was gonna read this, but I feel like that'll be a little bit redundant, and also maybe doubly redundant. This is just our sort of standard sort of pro forma language about, don't do anything really inappropriate and make it so that you have to be dragged out of here and everybody feels uncomfortable and terrible. Please don't do those things. The whole purpose of our conversation today is to explore, or one of the purposes is to explore having conversations about important and difficult topics and doing it in a constructive way. So of course we value your opinion, we value your participation, but we also value sort of respect for each other's opinions. So that is one note that I want to share. Also, the way that we're going to be doing Q&A for most of the day is through a QR code where you can submit questions, and this laptop up here on the table is sort of recording those questions, and then the moderator can take them and feed them to the panel during the Q&A part of their sessions. So scan the QR code. If you're having a hard time with that, you can kind of sneak up to one of us on the staff during the during one of the sessions, and we can try and give you the direct URL if the QR code isn't working. We really, wanted to do it this way, give you time to formulate your questions, give our moderator kind of the ability to sort of sift through and find the ones that he or she thinks will be most constructive. So the QR code is in your program. If you don't have a program, they're at the beginning of the room, outside the room. You can go grab one. And then I think the last thing I want to mention before I introduce our first moderator, who will introduce the panelists, is, I'm not sure if it says this on the program or not. It does. Closing reception. I know some of you will be in and out today, but I hope you can make it back for 4:30 when we'll have some snacks, some drinks, a time to kind of decompress and talk to each other about what what's gone on during the day or whatever else. So please try and get back here or stay here for 4:30 so you can join us after. And with that, I just want to introduce our moderator for the first panel and ask our panelists to come up on stage. So Eric McDaniel is our moderator. He is, let me get his bio. Eric is professor of government and the co-director of the Politics of Race and Ethnicity Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. His research examines how the intersection of race and religion influenced the American political landscape. His book, Politics in the Pews, The Political Mobilization of Black Churches, provides an explanation for why some black churches choose to engage the political world while others do not. His most recent book, The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics, explores the ramifications of Americans believing that their nation is God's chosen nation. Currently, he's working on a project examining what people believe their religion calls upon them to do and the political and social consequences of these beliefs. Additionally, he's working on projects concerning religious freedom and the role of religion in shaping health behavior and health policy attitudes. His research has been published in several academic journals. He's also published opinion pieces in several national outlets. Eric, welcome to the stage. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for participating. Eric was also a member of our faculty committee that developed the program for this day. So thanks for that too, Eric.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Apologize. The Texas humidity is getting to me a little bit, so if I'm sweating a bit, I apologize. I want to introduce our panelists, and I'm extremely excited about this panel and what we'll be talking about, because it fits within my wheelhouse, but also I'm a fan of their work, and so it's good to sometimes reconnect with some and meet for the first time others and the work that they've done. So the first panelist I want to bring forward is Professor Sahar Aziz. Her scholarship is on the intersection of national security, race, religion, and civil rights, with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws on policies on racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. She is the author of The Racial Muslim, When Racism Squashes Religious Freedom, and the co-editor of The Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism. She also serves as the founding director of the Center for Security, Race Relations. Professor Aziz is a recipient of the Derek A. Bell Award from the Association of American Law Schools and was named a Middle Eastern or North African American National Security and Foreign Policy Next Generation Leader by the New America in 2020, and a Soros Equality Law Fellow. Next, we have Professor Stephen Collis, who is the author of The Immortals, Deep Conviction, Praying with the Enemy at Any Cost, and Habits of a Peacemaker. He is a professor at the University of Texas Law School and founding faculty director of UT's Beck-Logan First Amendment Center and the Related Law and Religion Clinic. He was a research fellow in the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School and an equity partner at Holland Hart LLP, where he was the chair of the firm's nationwide religious institutions and First Amendment practice group. Professor Collis has lectured across the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, Asia, and South America. So I guess you got a lot of freaking flyer miles. He has been interviewed and quoted by the Desert News, Bloomberg, NPR, Washington Post, Washington Times, Law 360, Public Square Magazine, NBC, the Salt Lake Tribune, PBS, Denver Business Journal, Law Week Colorado, CBN News, and many television shows, radio broadcasts, and podcasts. Professor Collis graduated magna cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School and holds an MFA in creative writing from Virginia Commonwealth University. One thing I forgot to note is that Professor Aziz is a graduate of the University of Texas Law School. And last but not least, we have Professor Andrew Lewis from the University of Cincinnati, who is an associate professor in the School of Public and International Affairs and the executive director of the Portman Center for Policy Solutions at the University of Cincinnati. He is the author of The Right's Turn in Conservative Christian Politics, How Abortion Transformed the Culture Wars, and the co-author of The Full Armor of God, The Mobilization of Christian Nationalism in American Politics. He currently serves as the co-editor and chief of the political science journal Politics and Religion. His first book was awarded the American Political Science Association's 2018 Hubert Morgan Award for the best book on religion and politics. In 2022, he received the University of Cincinnati's highest teaching honor. He holds a PhD in political science from American University. And I should also admit that Andy is a co-author. So it's great to have
that
everyone
should have been
here.
at the top.
Was that?
That should have been at the top.
Yeah, it should have been, yeah. So I'm riding his coattails. But what the nature of this panel is, given the conversations we're having right now about religion and the arguments about religious freedom, what exactly does religious freedom look like? And how should we conceptualize it? And what are the benefits and burdens of religious freedom, and how in democracy can we advance this? And what I want to do is start off and provide each of the panelists about 3 to 4 minutes to describe their work and their thoughts on religious freedom. From there, I'll pose a few questions, but then I will open it up to the audience's questions. I think we talked about the order earlier. I think we'll start with Professor Collis first.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the kind introduction and for everyone being here. What a wonderful space and a wonderful opportunity. Since we only have 3 to 4 minutes, I'll just jump right in. First off, speaking of religion, I will tell you that when I chose to come to the University of Texas as a professor, I didn't realize what kind of religious mess I was getting into until I was in the Austin airport, and I was wearing my little UT Horns pin, and when I went through security, it had gotten twisted so that it was kind of sideways and upside down. And some woman started screaming at me from across the airport how my horns were down and I needed to fix it. Came to deeply understand the true religion here at the University of Texas. That said, so I'm a scholar of religious freedom, First Amendment law generally. I like to tell a story from when I was a little boy about how we get in trouble in life when we think we understand something and have strong opinions about it, but we don't. And the story I like to tell is when I was a 9-year-old boy growing up in a little town in New Mexico, my family didn't really have a lot of money. We had a small house and we all shared one bathroom. And little boys like me back then, it was with hair like mine, it was cool to spike up our hair. So I went into this shared bathroom and I got the mousse. I spiked up my hair and I felt pretty good about myself. And I came strutting out of the bathroom. And right when I came out, my mom walked by and she stopped me and she started sniffing. And she said, "What is that smell?" And I very proudly said, "It's the mousse." And her eyes got really big and she grabbed me, she spun me around, ran me back into the bathroom, shoved my head into the sink and started washing my hair out. Turns out that what I thought was mousse was actually her hair removal product, Nair. And all of my hair started falling out. And I learned, and I looked like I had some horrible illness for the rest of the summer. I learned a valuable lesson from that, though. We get in trouble in life when we think we understand something and we don't. And I have found that there are a few things that people think they understand more than things like religious freedom and freedom of speech, when most of us have absolutely no idea. And even if we do have an idea, we're usually not talking about the same thing. So when I talk about religious freedom, what I mean by the term religious freedom is it is the project of trying to figure out how people of very diverse religious beliefs, every religious belief you can imagine, can thrive alongside one another in the same society. It's the project of figuring out how to calibrate the law so that we can achieve that end goal. And in the United States, at least, the way this has developed is we have laws that are meant to limit how much government can burden the free exercise of religion. So government can burden the free exercise of religion, but we have laws that limit how much government can do that. And then we have laws that limit how much government can favor one religion or religious belief over another. And the way these principles manifest themselves in the Constitution, at least, is through two important clauses. One clause is called the Free Exercise Clause, and the other clause is called the Establishment Clause. An establishment of religion is essentially a state church. It's a term of art. It's not a religion that's been established. And so we know government is limited in how much it can establish a religion. We know government is limited in how much it can burden the free exercise of religion, or at least in theory, that's how religious freedom is supposed to work in the United States. And then we have quite a bit of statutory law, so law that is not constitutional law, but law that is passed as statutes that are meant to both limit government and to prohibit, or at least limit private discrimination based on religion. All of that together, theoretically, is supposed to achieve religious freedom in the United States. Now, there are lots of debates, lots of debates about the scope of each of those freedoms. Scholars disagree vehemently, justices and judges disagree vehemently. We are constantly trying to figure out how those freedoms, what is their scope, not just their scope, but how impactful should they be? Do they involve some categorical bans? Do they involve limited bans? How much do they actually limit government? But in theory, at least, those freedoms together, however we define their scope, create religious freedom in the United States. There are not only current debates about what the scope of those freedoms should be, but there is a significant gap between the theory of religious freedom and how it's actually put into practice, as you might guess. So historically, we have had long periods where we've provided almost no protection for the free exercise of religion. We've had long periods where we've actually provided almost no protection against state establishments. Different religious groups often get treated differently depending on what community we're in. Federal judges don't understand the law at all. So it's kind of a nightmare trying to get them to understand it. And so we have, there's a huge gap between practice and theory, and it's always important to keep that in mind as we're exploring all of this. But at the end of the day, that is the fundamental way, at least, that we tend to talk about religious freedom in the United States. We talk about the protection for free exercise, the protection against an establishment of religion, and laws that prevent private discrimination based on religion. And then we move forward from there to figure out, what are the debates and where can we all agree on what those laws and rights should mean. So that is a very brief, hopefully 3 to 4 minute introduction into religious freedom in the United States.
So next we'll have Professor Aziz.
Well, thank you so much to the University of Texas Department of Liberal Arts that's hosting this conference, and thank you to the leadership of Dean Ann Huff-Stevens and the entire department for having the courage and intellectual integrity to wrestle with some of the most pressing issues of public importance facing our society today. And what a pleasure it is to be back at my alma mater, where I have fond memories as a graduate student and law student, developing my critical thinking skills through exposure to different ideas in the classroom, to lectures on topics in which I may disagree with the speaker, and participation in student protests and counter-protests. To me, that is the America that I know. And finally, Ramadan Mubarak to those who are observing this month of fasting that is practiced by 1.8 billion people across the world. So my research focuses on the denial of religious freedom or the lack of religious pluralism as experienced by many Muslims in the United States, past and present. I spent 5 years researching and writing and producing my 4th child, The Racial Muslim When Racism Crosses Religious Freedom. Really long gestation period, but doesn't ask for money when finished. But in this project, I sought to answer the question, how does a country that privileges religious freedom in its constitution and in its statutes and in its social norm so openly discriminate against a religious minority and explicitly vilify Muslims in national security laws, immigration enforcement, electoral rhetoric, mainstream media, and many other forms. Because I would argue that the same country that claims to be the beacon of freedom, where religious minorities experiencing religious persecution in other countries can seek haven here from persecution abroad. Yet, what Muslims as a collective have experienced since 9/11 would be described as religious persecution if they were Christians in a Muslim majority country. So why the failure to live up to our stated commitments to religious freedom and religious pluralism when it comes to this religious minority community? Well, I proffer that the social construction of the race of adherence to a particular faith or religion impacts their ability to experience religious freedom and in turn influences how religious pluralism is practiced in our society. So Muslims are treated, I argue that Muslims are in fact treated more like an inferior race rather than a religious minority deserving of protection under our laws and norms. And once you are in the analytical framework of race, then the disparate treatment of Muslims is indeed quite consistent with how US society, politicians, and the legal system has treated racial minorities for over a century. And the disconnection, the cognitive dissonance or the inconsistencies start to make more sense. So my intersectionality approach argues that being a racial minority also affects how a particular religious minority experiences or not religious freedom. So, for example, my argument would go as follows. A white Mormon experiences religious freedom differently than an Arab Muslim, even though they are both religious minorities. And I would argue we need to explore how that Mormon is raised as white and how that Muslim is raised as non-white when we're trying to understand how they experience religious freedom. And again, it is intentionally a provocative thesis because I think we need to wrestle with the intersection of race and religion. And I'll also point out, and I think I would be interested if people, what they think of this, but I also argue that Muslims as a group in the United States are raised as brown or non-white because they are incorrectly presumed to all be Arab, right? So when I say Muslim, many of you, if you're thinking what image comes to mind, it is of an Arab-looking person, which is not someone who is of European-looking, right? And race is a social construct. I admit that. But as a result, and only, a very small percentage actually of Muslims are Arabs in the world. So just think about that. The vast majority are outside the Middle East. So finally, I'll just give a little bit of a overview of what I think of when I think of religious freedom or when I'm trying to analyze what is religious freedom. I think there are at least 4 things we need to look at. Identity, beliefs, dress, and conduct, right, are the primary ways in which religion impacts an individual's life. So, for example, when a Muslim or Muslim community experiences adverse consequences because they identify as Muslim, hold certain Islamic beliefs, wear a hijab or other clothing that is ostensibly Islamic, or engage in conduct, including worship, but not just worship, prescribed by their religion, then they are not experiencing meaningful religious freedom, right, when they have adverse consequences. And those adverse consequences can fall into at least 3 categories of impeding religious freedom: legal prohibitions or mandates, private actors, policies and customs and practices, and social norms in a particular context. And so I'm happy to go into the details of how that actually plays out, but I think we should just be thinking about those specific ways in which religious freedom is tested, at least with regard to Muslims. And again, I think that that also allows us to compare and contrast with other religious minorities and taking into consideration how they are raced in a particular moment in time, because race is a social construct that does change over time. Many of you who are raced as white today were not socially raced as white 100 years ago. If you were Jewish or Catholic, you were the not quite white. You were the in-between race. And so that also is an example of how race is socially constructed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Lewis.
Well, thank you all for having us. Eric, thanks for the generous introduction. The University of Texas for hosting us. College of Liberal Arts for putting this together. It's going to be a good conversation. I'll just say, I'm really looking forward to the question, so I'll be as brief as I can. I think religious freedom is centrally important. It's important to how we live together, and I think it's really important for how we think about democracy. That if we have to live together and we have to tolerate people who think and act differently than we do in order to make this work. And I think religious freedom is a core part of being engaging in democratic self-government. It's a core part of how we think about these freedoms. It's really important the way it has developed in American politics. I think there's a real tension, as we've talked about, between ideals and the development of principles and application. And there are many periods of time in which that's been problematic, but then I think there's also been real development, improvement, real influence in the way we think about human rights, the way we think about individual freedoms and liberties that are important to, it's important to walk through those nuances together, and I hope we get to do some of that today. One of the things I'm really interested in is the sort of politicization, that's really hard to say at 9:30 in the morning, of religious freedom. This idea like, for example, in the middle of the 20th century, religious liberty was, I think, a core liberal legal project supported by groups like the ACLU, the leading Jewish advocacy organizations, who are at the cornerstone of thinking about human rights and the courts and the constitutionalism of expanding individual freedoms. And you get a bunch of religious minority groups who are at the centerpiece of all the case law that you learn in constitutional law courses from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even to the 70s. And that project has changed. And religious liberty has become increasingly tied to Republican politics, the mobilization of Christian conservatives. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is figure out, like, what are the mechanisms that I have attributed to that, and then what are the impacts for the close tying of religious liberty and religious freedom politics into how we think about the core part of religious freedom in our democracy, in working and living together. One of the other things, so I do a good bit with survey data on religious freedom, and so trying to understand what's the public's role in these constitutional conversations, and so trying to understand the changes of public attitudes and how that's linked into court cases, to advocacy groups. And then as a piece of that, trying to understand what types of messages or what types of approaches might improve our sense of religious freedom for everyone. And so a series of survey experiments and things over time, trying to understand, like, okay, can you deploy certain types of messages or scenarios which might enhance people's vision of religious freedom for groups that maybe not their own group? And so trying to understand both the causes and consequences of polarization and potentially some ways in which that might be overcome. It's increasingly challenging in a polarized world when one core liberty is tied to a particular party, and we have strong views about parties. And so what happens is, when you show the same religious freedom statement and you tie it to one political party, the other party thinks less of religious freedom, just by itself, right? And then you tie it to their party, then they think more highly of it. And so how do you escape that polarization? And one of the things I think is that there are real threats to religious freedom out there, and one of the real threats of religious freedom is the entering into polarized culture war politics. That is the framework in which we discuss this core right, is a major threat to having it be there for all of us. And so these are some of the things that I'm engaging with, and I hope that we can talk about. But my core interest, I think, is at the intersection of what we might think as constitutionalism and the public, and how the public thinks of their rights, and how that connects in the way that the Supreme Court does. So with that, the last thing I'll say, I'm now very scared about hair product, and so I'm going, tomorrow morning, thankfully I didn't travel with anything rogue, but I'm gonna be very careful about this, so thank you for that.
Whenever I stay at friends' houses, I read the bottles very carefully in the shower. Like, if they're like, oh, just use our shampoo, I'm like, let's make really sure this is shampoo.
Well, I can attest that mine is due to genetics, not Nair. So thank you all so much for those opening remarks. I think they are extremely thought-provoking, and I like the fact that you were able to introduce the audience to your work and how you've been approaching issues related to religious freedom. So, so these are some questions that I have for you all, and looking for anybody's response. The first question I have is, we've talked about religious freedom, and I think what Professor Lewis has pointed to is some of the issues of when is it seen as religious freedom, what is it not. So my question is, when does religious freedom become oppression? So specifically, when does seeking religious freedom or the seeking religious freedom and the rhetoric around religious freedom, when is it really a mask for oppression of a particular group?
Could I just jump in real quick? So my initial thoughts on this are that in my book, Habits of a Peacemaker, I talk about how critical it is to make sure we're always talking about the same thing, and that if a question gets framed one way, to reframe it so we're all on the same page. And for me, I struggle to answer that question in the initial framing, because when I think of religious freedom, I think of what I talked about. It's both, it's protecting everyone's free exercise of religion to some degree, and it's protecting everyone against everyone else's religion to some degree. So in that sense, when you think about it that way, the question doesn't make sense. But also in that same vein, if we think about protecting the free exercise of religion, there is a doctrine that has developed in the courts, and again, we argue constantly over the scope of this doctrine, but it's called the third-party harm doctrine. And the idea is, what if protecting someone's free exercise of religion will cause harm to third parties, right? People who are not the beneficiaries of the religious behavior itself. And the law is calibrated in a way that if those harms rise high enough to the level of what we might call a compelling interest, then someone's free exercise rights might have to yield to ensure that they don't cause harm to others. Just to give an example, I worked on a matter involving the Amish up in Minnesota. And it was actually a really cool case, speaking about living together in a pluralistic society. I had students working with me on that case. There was a Hasidic Jew, a Muslim, a gay atheist, a Catholic, a Protestant, and a Latter-day Saint, all working together on behalf of this little understood religious minority in the wilds of Minnesota. The claim in the case, however, was that the county was claiming that they had to force the Amish to use technology against their religion, and the technology was septic tanks. The argument that the county was making was that unless they forced the Amish to use septic tanks, the Amish's way of treating their water was going to poison everybody else in the community. Well, if the county could have actually proved that and shown it, then that third-party harm, allowing the Amish to use the technology that they wanted, would cause harm to third parties, would then trump the Amish's claim for religious freedom, and the Amish would lose. Turns out that the county couldn't even come close to proving this, and after 8 years of litigation, then the government came and said, you know what, we actually could have accommodated your clients from the beginning, and there was never really a threat here. But if they could have proven it, if they could have shown, hey, there really is a risk to third parties that will cause real harm to them, then that's where free exercise gives way. And if we were to say that the protection of free exercise is so absolute that the Amish in a case like that should win, then you could see how the protection for the free exercise of religion might rise to the level of oppressing others, where someone's ability to practice their religion causes literally physical health harm to someone else in the community.
So I think that point about harm is one of the key things. I mean, in the middle of what we might call the religious liberty wars, which were a few years ago, which I think have dissipated from the headlines. I mean, you didn't hear a lot about religious freedom in the most recent presidential campaign or State of the Union, as you might have had in 2016 or so. There were advocacy groups who say, religious freedom should do no harm. I think there's a question of like, what do we mean by harm, and what are the levels? I think those are things that we have to adjudicate and think through. But it's a good principle, like to say, like, okay, harm. So when you express rights and liberties, like, we should think about harms and third-party harms. The other thing I would say is that there's the potential for religious liberty claims to move in a way that crosses over into the Establishment Clause. And so I think we would consider that a potential harm. For example, in the pushback against the school prayer cases in the 1960s, there was a growing development. In fact, this is in some ways in some of the conservative, right-oriented religious liberty advocacy started to really develop. And it was using religious liberty and religious freedom arguments to sort of re-engage on the school prayer front. That evolved over time to being more of a pluralistic, like if you're going to open spaces to other groups, you have to open them to these Christian groups. But there's a potential that you could say, oh, religious liberty means we have the liberty to establish ourselves in a way. And I think that potentially, that establishment could lead to what we might think of as coercion or some of the principles of how we understand the Establishment Clause. And so I think there's a potential for that sort of harm or that sort of oppression to come out of some types of religious liberty advocacy. I think that's probably not the core of all the legal questions, but it is a part of the political questions that are going on, right? And the political movement. And I would say the political mobilization of what we think about religious liberty matters for how we think about the legal protections and how we think about the status of rights. So that'd be another ad I would put on the list.
So I think there's at least three kind of concepts that we're discussing either explicitly or implicitly. The first is that religion is special in the United States. We've decided that in our First Amendment, we've decided that in various statutes, and it's become also a social norm, meaning that when, as compared to your preferences for fashion, food, music, and other non-religiously based aspects of your life. And as a result, the second point is that in order to have religious freedom, you often need religious accommodation. And that's why it's usually religious minorities who are bringing these cases. Because if you are a member of the majority religion in a particular factual context, meaning Texas is different than New Jersey, it's different than California and different parts of a state, the majority is setting the norms. That's one of the privileges of being in a majority group, is that you tend to have access and representation to developing the laws and the statutes and the norms and the customs in your daily lives and your environment. When you're a minority, you tend, by definition, not to have that same privilege, so you need that accommodation. The third is when you're talking about the culture wars, which religion is certainly has, I think, since the founding of this country, been at the center of many culture wars, is the interreligious versus intra-religious disputes. And so, for example, when you examine the way in which Mormons, I'll use Mormons and Muslims, I talk a little bit about Mormons here, and I will say Catholics as well. Mormons and Catholics, oftentimes the form of discrimination and at least religious bias tends to be, at least from my readings, an intra-Christian dispute. Right? There are disputes as to whether those particular faiths are quote-unquote legitimate or not based on the majority, let's say Protestants, at least historically they've been the majority, whereas when you're looking with Muslims, it's an inter-religion. And you see that even in the Middle East, which I study that region as well, the way that Baha'is are treated, which is an intra-religious, or Sufis, is different than the way Christians in the region, right? And these are all indigenous populations. These are not foreigners who come in. And so sometimes the intra-religious disputes can be much more vicious because they get into theological disputes as opposed to the inter, which is more, you're an outsider and you want us to change our way of life for you. And that is a different dynamic. So I just want to use a couple of examples to get your mind thinking. Here's a hypothetical. We're all professors, so. There's a mosque in your community that wants to announce the adhan, which is the call to prayer. If you go to any Muslim majority country, you will hear 5 times a day the adhan, the call to prayer, on a speaker, and everyone will hear it, and oftentimes the biggest complaint of the neighbors is how awful the particular imam's voice is and how he doesn't have a melodic call to prayer and the other one does. So something you don't deal with in America. But it is a noise that you hear. So if you are Muslim, you're used to that. It's just part of your daily life and it's accepted. But this mosque in the United States, in a predominantly Christian environment, wants to do that. Well, the first prayer right now is at 6:30 in the morning. It sometimes can be at 5:30, it's about the sunrise. The last call can be as early as 8 p.m. if it's the winter, or as late as 10 or 10:30 p.m. if it's the summer. And then you have 12, around 3 to 4, 7. Do you accommodate them? And that's where you get the religious freedom tensions is, should you, is this a nuisance? And then what about church bells? Are you more accustomed to hearing church bells, whereas someone who's not Christian may say, what's all that noise? Why are these church bells ringing however frequently they ring? Or you may say, well, but it's not at 6 in the morning, or is it? And would that make a difference? So that's just an example of, now that is actually not, to my knowledge, an issue that has been litigated, to my knowledge. I don't know, maybe Steve has, most of the religious freedom cases that are litigated when it comes to Muslims are denials of building of mosques, expansion of mosques, or renovation of mosques. Or things such as dress. A woman who wants to wear the hijab, the company has a policy of no headwear, no headgear, and they treat a hijab the same way they would treat a hat. And they'll say, and that's where religion is special. They'll say, well, this is not a fashion preference. This is what I believe is a religiously mandated obligation. Or it could be pork, no pork in certain social events or food options. Or it could be prayer. I need a place to pray because there are times during the workday where I need to pray, and I would prefer, even though I don't want to just put my prayer rug right here and everybody watches me pray, especially since this is not a Muslim majority environment, because if it was, we could just say, hey, let's all pray. It's time to pray. Whoever wants to pray, we pray communally. And I really don't want the stairs, so can I have a private room? And no, I can't pray in the bathroom because it's unclean and there needs to be cleanliness. So those are the types of issues, that's kind of the granular level when religious freedom and religious accommodation tend to come to the forefront.
Thank you all so much. The next question I have for you is religious pluralism something that a democracy can truly achieve? We hear a lot about the value of religious pluralism in America and the commitment to democracy in America, but is religious pluralism something that a democracy can truly achieve?
It's a work in progress. I mean, I think it's always going to be a work in progress when you have multi-ethnic democracies and pluralism. But I would say there are both flaws, and those flaws show up frequently, and at certain times that they're much more evident. But then there also has been, I would say, real progress in the way we think about religious pluralism in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has had varieties of religions for a long time, and I think while there's been real moments of discrimination, threats, challenges, and all kinds of things, there also has been some long-standing trajectory of being able to live and work together, and you see religious intermarriages have gone up over time, and a whole host of things that I think are somewhat positive. The other thing I will say, like on the public opinion data, people are generally pretty supportive of even the religious freedom rights of minorities. I've done a lot of stuff where we tested Hindus and Native Americans and even Muslim rights to build mosques, and even Republicans and evangelical Christians are generally pretty supportive. Their rates don't decline too much, but when you get to the specifics, when you get to who is really being discriminated against, feeling like how you feel towards other groups, like those sort of group-based things, there are real divides and divisions, which can lead to really terrible episodes. And so I would just say, perfect, no, but possible for moving us forward, I would say yes.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think the United States is an example of this. Despite all the problems we have, and there are plenty of them, this is the most religiously diverse populace in the history of humanity and even on the world today, and we live alongside one another in relative peace. We have lots of problems. We have lots of problems with enforcing the ideals of religious liberty law, but I would defy folks to find another country in which you find so much religious diversity and people still able to live alongside one another. It's actually quite miraculous. In fact, if you look around the world right now at all of the genocides that the U.S. government has actually labeled a genocide, and of course that's a whole other debate as to what counts as a genocide or not, but with the U.S. Genocide, when the U.S. government labels something a genocide, is a term of art with significant legal obligations. So the U.S. government's very careful when they label things. But if you look at all of them happening in the world right now that the U.S. has labeled a genocide, they're all based on religion. We don't have that. We're not seeing that in the United States. Now, we have had a history of problems like that in the United States, but as we have progressed and we've slowly started to better and more fully enforce our religious freedom laws, we're seeing that people of very different religious beliefs can thrive alongside one another in the same society. And I guess my view is we need to continue to push and push and push to get to the ideal and make sure that these ideals of religious liberty are actually being enforced for everyone, everywhere.
I unfortunately don't have the same idea. I used to have that same idealistic view, but 9/11 changed a lot for me and the communities that I work with and that I'm a member of. I think that when you talk about religious pluralism, you are outside the area of law. I think law is more of a consequence and a manifestation of religious pluralism or the lack thereof. I think you're dealing more with culture, with education, with media, all of the things that develop our norms and what is expected of us in how we treat each other. And then that then translates into whether accommodations are made, whether people are not socially stigmatized or marginalized or feel as if they don't belong in a particular space, whether it's the workplace or the public space or university. And again, I'm staying within my lane of expertise, and so that's why I'm intentionally talking about Muslims, because I don't want to pontificate about other faiths who everybody has different experiences. And even within Muslim communities, right, there are different experiences. But what we saw in the last 20 years, and the Beckett Fund, which is a religious liberty litigation shop, represented many of these Muslims, but we saw mosques that were vandalized. We saw mosques that were burned down. In Victoria, Texas, there was a mosque that was burned down too. Entirely. It was arson, and it was a bias. It was a hate crime. We've seen women who are wearing headscarves who are getting physically attacked, which was causing other women to take off their headscarves out of fear. Just as a specific example for myself, it is a very common tradition. It's not religiously mandated to put your Quran in your car. It's kind of like to protect yourself when you're traveling. And I remember when 9/11 happened, I took my Quran out of my car, because I was convinced that my car was going to get vandalized, because the hate in the media and the hysteria was so anti-Muslim, and it was frightening. So there's a sense, you have to ask the religious minorities or those who are not in a position to set the norms whether they're experiencing religious pluralism, because oftentimes they're the beneficiaries of religious pluralism. We all benefit from it as the type of society we have, but in terms of the daily lives and lived experiences, it's often those who are in the minority status, and that could include atheists, right? In a country where many people believe that Christianity is the normative religion, right? And so I think it's important to just look at the way in which racism and racial stereotypes of particular faiths affect our willingness to practice religious pluralism, and whether we exceptionalize certain religions in how we practice or conceive of religious pluralism. And so I'll just give you the example of the anti-Sharia campaigns. I don't know if you all remember those. Sharia is just the Arabic word for Islamic law. And similar to the Jewish religion, there is an entire body of law, right, that is based on the interpretation of the Quran, the Hadith. It's a whole jurisprudential system. And simply because Muslims were asking for religious accommodation in specific contexts, there was a hysterical right wing, and I'm going to be partisan here because it was the Republicans who proudly were pushing it, at least a portion of them, who were telling Americans 2% of the population, that's how many, there's only 2% of the US population is Muslim, 6 to 7 million, that's it. That they were all going to force everyone to adhere to Islamic law, and that the American legal system would be Islamic law. It was a ridiculously racist, hysterical campaign. And it caused a lot of fear and harm and trauma to the 2% of the population who couldn't say, well, I've got Congress people that I can talk to that understand. I have people that at the head of the universities that can understand. I've got people in state legislatures that can understand. There's no representation in the formal halls of power to be able to say, let me explain to you what Sharia is. Let me explain to you when I want religious accommodation, I'm not trying to impose it on other people. I'm simply practicing American religious freedom and engaging in religious pluralism. But what I'm finding is that instead of people saying, oh, of course, as long as it doesn't infringe on my rights, I respect that. And that's part of the concept of religious freedom. That wasn't what they were facing. And so I think we do need to get to that point, especially in education, to be able for all of us to, I don't like the word tolerant because it sounds like you're begrudgingly accepting someone, but embracing that and saying, let's just learn from each other, but no one's trying to force any particular practice on another. But again, I think the hardest cases, the case studies, is when, how does my freedom infringe on your freedom? And there are some really hard cases. And those are the ones that I think are worth wrestling with.
I will just jump in and say that I feel like the way, especially some of the center-right religious freedom groups acted in some of the Muslim case. So you had groups who were going to stand up for Muslims building mosques in New Jersey and in Tennessee and other places. They got enormous pushback from their constituents and dropped out of some of those cases. The ones who remained, some of those got fired by their religious denominational bodies. You had basically no people who had been advocating for Muslims and religious minorities on religious freedom cases. They all remained really silent in the Trump travel ban case, choosing not to take a position. That did real damage to how we think about legal and constitutional pluralism in the defense of religious freedom. And so I think that should certainly be acknowledged. The question I have is, like, how do you get those groups to activate more? And some of them are working in that direction, but some of them sort of stood down to a lot of right-wing constituent activism, for sure.
Well, it's important, though, when you talk about religious freedom advocacy groups, to understand that there are a multitude of them,
That's
right?
true.
There are pro-Muslim religious freedom advocacy groups. There are just Christian religious freedom advocacy groups. There are some groups who really do advocate for the religious freedom of all. There are lots of clinics. I help run a clinic here at the University of Texas. We represent Muslims regularly. I'm always doing things for Muslims in relation to mosques and land use issues, and we're getting ready to file a case in the a brief in the Supreme Court on Monday, representing something like 10 separate Muslim groups. There are Seventh-day Adventist-specific religious freedom groups. There are Jewish-specific religious freedom groups. So basically every religion out there has their own little religious freedom group. And then there are some groups who very much try to and purport to represent everyone. So there's no question there are some what you might call right-wing or Christian-specific religious freedom groups who aren't going to advocate on behalf of Muslims, but I think it's critical not to just throw all these groups together and treat them as if they're one monolith. There are lots of different religious freedom groups, including the ACLU and others, who jump in on these cases and take a variety of viewpoints. The question is the law calibrated in a way that all of those groups working together are going to help us get to a better outcome towards this goal of having a religiously diverse society? And I think by and large that is true, but it's not entirely. Again, there are a lot of flaws, but it's important to recognize how diverse the religious freedom advocacy community truly is.
Can I just respond? I agree with you. I think that what the concerns that certain religious minority groups have in feeling kind of overwhelmed and besieged is that it's politicians, it's the media. I think that for the most part, the lawyers do the right thing because they're well trained, and we are indoctrinated in our education system to understand and respect religious freedom and establishment clause. It's part of our training. The concern that the harm tends to come from the politicians who have the bully pulpit and the silence. I think you bring up a good point. And I say this to my own community often, is you have to step up and speak up even when it doesn't affect you. If you find that something is happening or people are saying things that are harming others that go against your principles. So you may believe in religious pluralism and religious freedom, but you only really speak up and activate when it harms you. And I think that is an important principle of religion, or an important tool or strategy for protecting religious pluralism. And so what I wish we had seen more of was not so much in the litigation space, because I do think that like the Beckett Fund in your clinic and others were doing, and in the ACLU, were doing the right thing in terms of protecting the principle and the law and defending the law. But it was wishing that, I think 60% of US adults identify as Christian, according to the Pew Research Center. That within those 60%, because it's the majority, there's power with that there would be more letters to congressional or elected officials or media outlets who do have bully pulpit and say, what you just said is really hateful. It makes our Muslim neighbors feel unsafe, or our Seventh-day Adventists, or our Mormon neighbors. This is not the type of speech and rhetoric and policies that this country should have, regardless, who you're talking about. And that is what I worry has been eroded. And part of it is the polarization, but it's a challenge for many of us is how do we not only defend ourselves when personally our communities are affected, but how do we defend others when it's being very principally focused? And we need to work more on that, I think.
Thank you all so much. I know we're running low on time, but I do want to bring in at least one or two questions from the audience. The first question I have for you, and I think this lines up with what we've just been talking about, how do you mitigate or balance the misalignments between religious freedom as it exists in law versus how it exists in the public consciousness?
This is a huge problem. I mean, what both my colleagues have identified here, I've got now, as everyone's been talking, I put down 5 separate categories. There's religious freedom in politics, religious freedom in law, in theory, in practice, and then in public perception. And each of those is its own separate sphere that are at varying degrees of success and failure, right? I was at a conference once, I'll just comment on this about religious liberty and public perception. Across the Western world, there was a survey done of adults over 18 about do you believe religion is a net good on society or a net negative? And for the first time a couple years ago, the majority of people said it was a net negative. Well, I was in a conference with all of the major religion reporters from every major media outlet in the country, the kind of the legacy outlets, so the New Yorker, the New York Times, Washington Post, PBS, NPR, The Atlantic, a whole bunch of these reporters. And somebody asked one of the group, the panel of reporters, they said, someone in the audience asked, why is it that you never report on the good that religion is doing in society? You only report on the negative. And one reporter, to her great credit, from the New Yorker raised her hand and she said, well, I'll answer this. Look, I know that religion is doing a lot of good in the world, but it's not my job to report on things that are going fine. It's my job to report on when there's problems, right? So fair enough. I actually don't begrudge her for that, and I appreciate the honesty. But what does that mean? When you hear about a particular religion, you're going to hear about the clergy abuse scandal. You're not going to hear about the millions of hours of service and sacrifice and helping the poor and lifting up the hands who hang down and doing interfaith stuff. I mean, I've gotten invited to so many iftar celebrations this month at interfaith things where all these different religions are getting together during Ramadan to celebrate with their Muslim friends. The New York Times is not reporting on any of that, right? They're only going to report on if you hear some kind of conflict or there's been abuse or something like that. And that dramatically affects people's perception of religion, which then dramatically affects people's perception of religious liberty. And that is a real problem, I think, for religious liberty, but also just for being able to thrive together in a pluralistic society. We do not hear about the positives almost ever unless you're actively looking for them.
I'll just say, in some of the public opinion work I've done, if you show people an example of Muslims, for example, asking for religious accommodation, then they're more favorable, the people who are taking these surveys are more favorable to Christians asking for certain religious accommodations. Similarly, if you show a Christian leader advocating on behalf of Muslims and saying this also matters for us because their religious freedom protections are the same ones that we fly under, then you increase their level of support and their feelings towards their Muslim neighbors. And so I do think it takes people need to be doing this work. People are doing this work, but more of us need to be doing that work and showing those stories and why religious freedom cases and litigation matter for more than just the parties, They matter for other parties, but they also matter for our politics, right? They matter for our public. And so I think that sort of framework is really valuable.
I agree with much of what my colleagues have said. There's a couple things I'll just add. The first is and this is when going to the race and religion intersection. There are religious minorities in this country, Muslims are not the only ones, where what they experience is not just, part of it is about what's covered in the media, but not just domestic media, but also what's happening abroad. And that is an additional burden. So, for example, I sometimes will use and it's an empirical question, which is, if we were to do a survey of Russian Orthodox Americans, so Russian Americans who are Orthodox Christians, and Muslims who are from Palestine or from Lebanon or from Syria, certain countries where there's war and conflict, and ask them, have you found that you're being collectively punished in some way, right? That you are, whatever anti-Putin or anti-Russian politics that the US may have, do you feel that you're somehow held responsible, whether it's directly, indirectly, as opposed to, no, that's completely separate. We've been here for 2 or 3 generations. Nobody asks me, so, why do you people support this, or why do you people? That's not the case for Muslims, especially Arabs or those who are perceived as Arab and they're Muslim. And that's how they're, quote unquote, racialized in the US, where their religion isn't simply viewed through the lens of perhaps a specific domestic story, and often, I agree with you, it's usually something bad happened, but it's also what's happening abroad in Iraq. The last 25 years. And unfortunately, that shapes then people's public perceptions of that particular religion, usually in the negative, and then causes them to be suspicious of them and to view them not as just a religious minority seeking accommodation and equal treatment and religious pluralism, but this foreign, outside, racial other that's a danger to our society and our national security. So I think that's something that, oftentimes legal scholars will say that's a different area, but it does, in the lived experiences of the national security context and in the international relations context, does affect how they experience life. And then finally, I'll just say that I think it's really, really important for us to continue to stick to our principles and teach people the difference between self-interested politics and principles. Because wherever you are in the world, religion and politics always intersect. And oftentimes it's the political dimension that causes people to perhaps be less pluralistic or less accepting, and they can't distinguish between the religious practice, the religious faith, and it's all diverse, and all the diversity within a particular religion, and a special interest group, or a politician, or some bad actor. But religion and politics are, we all know this, it's very intersected, and I think that's what causes people to incorrectly, and your point is taken, to treat certain groups as monolithic, whether it's Christian groups as all Christian nationalists, or Muslim groups as all terrorists. But we need to learn how to separate that and let our students, when we're in university, have that critical thinking ability to go, well, do you actually understand the faith? Do you understand the different ways they practice, the different sects, the different contexts internationally, domestically, and then politics and how that, it's complicated. It's really complicated. So I think that religious pluralism is definitely a work in progress, but from my vantage point, I think unfortunately over the last 20 years we've stepped back a bit, and we really need to make up for that and keep moving forward. Because the 90s, from what I witnessed and experienced and saw, was very different for at least Muslims than after 9/11.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I realize an hour to talk about this is clearly not enough. You all have written entire books on the subject. But I want to thank you so much. I also want to thank the audience for the questions that were submitted. I truly appreciate the time and effort you took in thinking these things through. So I just want to give a round of applause for our panelists, and thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.